Welcome to High Scary Stories. Tonight we invite you into 10 wilderness horror stories encounters that never found an ending and never wanted one. These are tales from the edge of the trail, where the forest forgets the rules. And so do the things inside it. Here, what vanishes is not always lost, and what knocks may already be inside. This is High Scary Stories. Let's begin. Story 1. The Lantern in the Pine Barrens. I was 17 the summer my dad decided we should try real bonding by going camping for a week in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. It had been nearly a year since the divorce, and we were both still pretending we were fine. He had grown quieter, more practical, the kind of man who used silence like a shield. I was the opposite, fidgety, distracted, always half in my own head. I think he thought getting us away from phones and people would fix something, or at least keep us from talking about things we didn't know how to say. We packed light. 2 sleeping bags, 1 tent, a borrowed pickup, and a cooler of food we would end up finishing too quickly. He picked a remote clearing on state forest land, where there were no cell towers, no noise, and barely a trail in or out. I remember how dry the air felt when we got there, how tall the pines seemed to lean inward, like they were listening. We set up camp near a thin creek that twisted through the trees, its surface broken by patches of brown moss and small insects. It was almost peaceful. Almost. Looking back, I think I knew from the beginning something about the place didn't want us there. The first 2 days passed uneventfully, though the silence out there was heavier than I expected. No bird song in the mornings, no rustle of squirrels or chipmunks. Just the occasional creak of branches overhead and the constant low hum of insects. My dad didn't notice, or maybe he just didn't comment. He spent most of his time fishing near the creek or scribbling in the little leather-bound notebook he always carried. On the 3rd night, I woke up just past midnight to the sound of crunching leaves. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing through the cooler. But when I peeked out from the tent flap, I saw something I couldn't explain. About 20 yards beyond the trees, there was a soft, yellowish glow hovering midair. At first, I thought it might be a lantern, someone hiking or camping nearby, but the way it moved was wrong. It didn't bob like someone walking with a flashlight. It drifted smoothly from one tree to another, weaving in and out, without ever touching the ground. I froze watching it glide closer, then slowly pull back, as if it sensed I was watching. My skin prickled. I zipped the flap closed and lay there with my heart pounding, pretending I hadn't seen anything. The next morning, I asked my dad if there were any other campsites nearby. He shook his head, said we were at least 5 miles from the closest marked trail. I didn't mention the light. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the pines, I saw it again. Same color, same smooth floating movement. This time my dad saw it too. He squinted and said maybe it was a firefly, but neither of us believed that. It was too large, too bright, and it didn't flicker. He didn't say anything else, just sat staring into the trees, his hand resting quietly on the handle of the hatchet. That night, neither of us slept much. We didn't talk about it, but when I turned over in the tent, I saw my dad still awake, eyes open, and fixed on the ceiling like he was listening for something. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sound again, leaves crunching soft at first, then more deliberate. I sat up and he did too. Neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other, then slowly unzipped the tent flap. The light was back farther away this time, maybe 50 yards out, weaving between the trunks like it was waiting. Without a word, my dad grabbed the flashlight and motioned for me to stay put. I didn't listen. I slipped on my boots and followed a few paces behind him, trying to stay quiet. The forest swallowed sound quickly out there, but I could still hear his footsteps ahead. The lantern bobbed ahead, almost playful now, moving just far enough to keep its distance. Then it dipped suddenly behind a low ridge, disappearing into the trees. My dad hesitated, then followed it over the ridge. I ran to catch up, heart thudding in my chest. But when I reached the top and looked down, it was gone. No light, no sound, just trees. I called out once, twice. Nothing. I scrambled down the ridge, sweeping the flashlight in every direction, but the forest looked unfamiliar wrong somehow. The creek we had camped near should have been on my left, but now I couldn't even hear water. The trees seemed closer together, thicker, like the forest was closing in. Then the lantern reappeared, this time behind me. I spun around, and it hovered there for a moment, close now, just a few feet away. It wasn't glass. It had no handle. It looked like liquid light suspended in air, humming softly like a low note on a cello. And within it, just for a second, I saw something. A face. Not human, not exactly. Too smooth. Too wide. Watching me with something that resembled curiosity or maybe hunger. Then it blinked out. I ran. I don't know how long or in what direction. I just remember the trees whipping past and my lungs burning. When I finally stumbled back into camp, the fire was out and the tent was still zipped. My dad was gone. He never came back. When search and rescue combed the forest 2 days later, they found no trace of him. No boot prints, no body. Just me in that patch of forest that never felt the same again. They questioned me for hours. Rangers, deputies, even a man in a suit who never gave his name. I told them the truth, or as close as I could get without sounding insane. I said my dad wandered off chasing a light. That I tried to follow him. That I got lost. They chalked it up to disorientation, fatigue, maybe trauma. Said sometimes people just disappear in those woods. I remember one ranger looking at me a little too long, like he'd heard something similar before, but wasn't allowed to say. We left the next day. My aunt came to get me. She didn't ask many questions. I didn't volunteer much. My dad was declared missing, presumed dead, but I never really accepted that. He wasn't careless. He wouldn't have wandered off without a word. Not unless something made him. It's been 6 years now. I've never gone back to the Pine Barrens, though I've thought about it more than I'd like to admit. Every once in a while, I dream about that light. It floats just out of reach, humming softly, always just ahead. And sometimes in the dream, I see him standing inside it. Not frightened, not even sad. Just watching. Waiting, like he wants me to follow. Like it still isn't done. Story 2. The shack that smelled like rain. It was late spring when we decided to hike the old ridge trail in the Smoky Mountains, just a few hours outside Knoxville. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend Lacey, her cousin Trevor, and his girlfriend Mia. We were all in our 20s, chasing that feeling of being off-grid and unplugged. Trevor had found a route online that wasn't exactly official, but promised gorgeous views and an unmarked overlook that few people knew about. He was always chasing things like that, places without trail markers, corners of the world that hadn't been touched or posted about. We packed light, but brought enough to camp for 2 nights. The weather was warm and clear when we started, the trees just thick enough to keep us cool and shielded from the sun. Everything felt calm and familiar. We joked, snapped pictures, and followed the narrow switchbacks deeper into the forest. The trail was barely visible, in places more instinct than path, but Trevor seemed to know where he was going. We planned to make camp near an old creek bed he'd marked on his phone, but sometime in the late afternoon, the wind picked up. Not strong, just enough to carry a strange scent through the air. It was subtle at first. Damp earth, old moss, and something else I couldn't place. Like mold and rust, thick and wet. Lacey wrinkled her nose and said it smelled like rain. But the sky was blue. There were no clouds in sight. We pushed on, brushing it off as swampy runoff, or maybe a decaying tree nearby. But the smell didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger the deeper we hiked. The trail narrowed as we climbed a low ridge. And by the time we reached the top, the woods had grown strangely quiet. No wind, no bird song, not even the usual buzz of flies. It was like we had stepped into a pocket of silence. That's when we saw a shack tucked between two leaning pine trees, maybe 20 yards off the trail. It looked abandoned, and the roof bowed in the middle, and the boards warped with age. There were no windows, just a crooked door, and what looked like rusted hinges hanging loosely off one side. Trevor grinned, said something like jackpot, and veered off the trail toward it before any of us could say a word. Lacey and Mia hesitated, but followed him after a beat. I didn't want to go near it. Something about that place felt wrong. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became. Not just mold now, something sickly sweet beneath it, like rotting fruit soaked in stagnant water. Trevor reached the door and gave it a light push. It creaked open with a sound that didn't match its size, a deep groaning like something straining to breathe. Inside, the air was heavy and wet like the air right before a thunderstorm, except there was no storm. The room was bare except for a chair in the corner and a line of old glass jars on a shelf. I didn't step inside, but Lacey did. She turned to me, her voice low. "There's something carved into the walls," she said. "It's names. Dozens of them. Scratched in like tally marks all over." That's when the first drop of rain hit the roof, even though the sky was still clear. The sound of that single raindrop echoed across the warped roof louder than it should have been. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, a sudden downpour erupted above us, but the sky hadn't changed. It was still blue through the pine canopy. The rain smelled thick, like rust and mildew, like water that had sat too long in pipes. Mia screamed from just outside the door. She pointed toward the trees, her face pale. There were figures standing beyond the clearing still and half obscured like they were watching from just behind the veil of rain. My heart stuttered. I turned to Trevor, but he was already stepping inside the shack. I shouted his name. He didn't respond. He was staring at something behind the shelf of jars. Lacey reached for him, but as soon as she crossed the threshold, she jerked backward like she'd been shocked. Her hand recoiled, eyes wide. She said the air inside felt thick, almost gelatinous, and that something pressed against her chest the moment she tried to enter. Trevor didn't seem to notice. He kept walking deeper into that dim space, running his fingers along the wall carvings. The names, he said. They're all the same name. Over and over. Different handwriting, same name. And then he froze. Something wet and dark began trickling down the wall beside him, thick as syrup, and the smell hit me like a punch. Rot, deep and ancient. He turned to us slowly and whispered, "I can hear it breathing." We didn't wait. Lacey grabbed my arm and pulled me back, shouting at Trevor to move to run. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at the back of the shack like something was rising out of the shadows. Then the door slammed shut with a force that shook the ground. We ran toward it, tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. From inside, we heard a low gurgling sound, like water choking in a throat. Mia began to sob. And then just as suddenly as it began, the rain stopped. We managed to pry the door open, but the shack was empty. No Trevor, no shelves, no jars. just dry wooden walls and silence, as if no one had ever been there at all. We searched for hours circling the shack, calling Trevor's name, until our voices were raw. The rain never returned, but that scent damp rot and something sour lingered in the clearing long after the sky returned to its usual shade of blue. When we finally gave up and returned to the trail, none of us spoke. It was as if saying his name might pull something else out of the woods. We reported his disappearance that evening once we found a signal. Rangers hiked out with us the next day. We led them to the spot, but the shack was gone. Not destroyed, gone. No clearing, no warped wood. Just trees. Solid, undisturbed forest. They said maybe we had the location wrong. Maybe stress had scrambled our memories. But we knew. We all knew. Mia moved out of state a few months later and cut off contact. Lacey doesn't like to talk about it. She sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath like something's pressing down on her chest. As for me, I never hike off trail anymore. I stay on the marked paths. I ignore anything that smells like rain when it shouldn't. And every now and then, I dream of Trevor. He's still inside that shack, still whispering about names on the wall and something breathing just beyond the shadow. Story 3, Whitetail. My brother and I hadn't spoken in almost 3 years when he called out of the blue and invited me on a hunting trip. It was early November, just as the first frost had settled over the Montana backcountry, and he said it would be like old times, just the two of us, rifles slung over our shoulders, chasing whitetail through the thick pine. I didn't hesitate. Maybe it was the way he sounded tired, maybe even regretful, or maybe I just missed him more than I'd admitted. We'd grown up hunting with our dad before he passed, and back then my brother felt like a second shadow. But things had changed after the funeral. Words were said, some sharp, others left unsaid, but heavier still. This trip, I thought, could be our reset. We loaded up his old truck with gear and drove out to a patch of private land near the Bitterroot Valley. It was remote, cold, and still nothing but open sky and endless trees. We parked near an old trailhead and hiked 2 miles in before setting up camp. The air had that crisp, almost metallic bite of winter just beginning, and each breath felt sharp and clean. That night by the fire, we laughed more than we had in years. It felt like we were finally finding our way back to each other. But the forest had other plans. We set out just after dawn, rifles strapped to our backs and thermoses of lukewarm coffee in hand. A dusting of snow had fallen overnight, just enough to hush the forest and leave a clean slate of tracks to follow. My brother was always the better tracker, and I was content to let him lead, watching the way he moved through the trees with quiet confidence. About an hour in, we came across a trail of hoofprints, fresh, sharp, and deep. He crouched down, ran a hand along the edges, and said it looked like a good-sized buck. We followed the tracks northeast, deeper into the woods, where the trees grew denser and the air felt heavier. That was when I first noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but something more unnatural. No birds, no wind, not even the sound of our own footsteps crunching on the snow seemed right. The farther we walked, the more the woods seemed to close in around us. I started to feel uneasy, like we were being watched. My brother didn't say anything, but I noticed his shoulders stiffen slightly, his eyes scanning the tree line more than the trail. Then we found the clearing. At the center was a buck lying perfectly still in the snow, as if it had just bedded down. Its antlers were massive, too symmetrical to be real. But what froze me in place wasn't the size, it was the eyes. They were open, glassy, and staring right at us. Not in a dead way, in a waiting way. My brother raised his rifle slowly, but I touched his arm and whispered something's wrong. Before he could respond, the buck stood up. not slowly, not like an animal roused from rest. It moved in one smooth motion, too fast, too clean. Then it turned and walked into the trees, on two legs. My breath caught in my throat. My brother didn't say a word, but I heard his rifle lower with a soft click, like even the weapon understood it wasn't meant for what we'd just seen. The thing, whatever it was, disappeared into the trees, without a sound, leaving behind only those deep hoof prints in the snow. My brother turned to me pale and tight-lipped and said we needed to leave. I nodded. We didn't speak again until we reached our camp. But when we got there, something was wrong. The fire pit we had built was gone, not scattered or disrupted, gone as if it had never existed. Our tent had collapsed in on itself, and our gear was soaked as if left out for days. But the strangest part was the deer skull. It was sitting right in the center of camp, cleaned and hollow, with a strip of red cloth tied through one of the antlers. I recognized the cloth immediately. It had been the bandana my brother always tied to his rifle stock, a kind of charm or leftover superstition from our dad. I turned to him. His face was blank. He knelt beside the skull and didn't say anything for a long time. That night we didn't sleep. We didn't even build another fire. We just sat back to back with our rifles in hand, watching the dark between the trees. At some point I must have drifted off because I woke to a sound I'll never forget. A sharp guttural voice, low and ragged, calling my brother's name from somewhere beyond the tree line. Not shouting, just calling, over and over in the exact tone our father used to use. My brother stood up slowly. I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off. His eyes looked glassy, unfocused, like he was listening to something only he could hear. He walked into the woods without a word. I waited for 5 minutes, then 10, then an hour. He never came back. At sunrise, I followed his tracks as far as I could, but they just stopped, mid-stride in the snow like he had been lifted away. I found the bandana again a mile out, tied to a branch too high for anyone to reach. That was the last sign of him. And to this day, I still wake up hearing that voice whispering from the tree line, calling, always calling. The authorities searched for a week. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers. They asked me the usual questions. Was he depressed? Was he drinking? Had he talked about leaving? I told them the truth, or at least the version I thought they'd believe. That we got separated in the woods, that I lost his trail in the snow, that I never saw or heard him after that. They marked it as a missing person, probable misadventure, another lost hiker in the Montana wilderness. But I know better. I know what we saw. I know what walked into those trees. And I know my brother didn't just wander off. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of him, standing in that same clearing eyes, glassy face, expressionless, the skull of a whitetail buck resting over his head like a mask. He doesn't speak. He just raises one hand and points behind me, into the dark. I haven't been hunting since that trip. I sold my rifle, moved to the city, and tried to live like none of it happened. But I still can't look at deer the same way. I still check tree branches for red cloth when I hike. And when the wind cuts just right through the pines, I swear I hear my name spoken low guttural in a voice that shouldn't be human. Story 4. The Hollow in Tangle Creek. When I was a kid, my family owned a small cabin tucked away near a place called Tangle Creek in northern Michigan. It wasn't anything fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, and a screened-in porch that looked out over a thicket of birch and pine. We used to spend every summer there, no cell service, no TV, just the hum of mosquitoes. and the smell of lake water and campfire smoke. I hadn't been back in over 15 years when my mom called and said she was thinking about selling the place. She wanted me to go up there one last time, take what I wanted, say goodbye. It felt strange driving up alone. The gravel road hadn't changed. Neither had the faded sign half buried in weeds that still read, "Private property, no trespassing," even though everyone who ever visited was family. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, and quieter too, like it had been waiting for someone to return. As I stepped inside, a wave of nostalgia hit me. Old sleeping bags, scratched wooden floors, the scent of damp pine. But underneath that was something else. A memory I couldn't quite place, a feeling that something had happened there when I was young, something I'd forgotten. And as the sun dipped low behind the trees, the woods outside seemed to lean a little closer, as if ready to remind me. I spent the first evening cleaning out drawers and cupboards, sorting through things we'd left behind years ago. Faded trail maps, melted candles, a box of old Polaroids. Most of the photos were the kind that you'd expect bonfires fish held up proudly, kids squinting in the sun. But one picture stopped me. It was a shot of me and my cousin Ryan, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of a cluster of trees that didn't look familiar. Behind us, the woods were darker than they should have been, like the trees were packed too tightly together. And in the corner of the photo, half in shadow, there was a figure. Not close, not clear, just something tall and vaguely human, blurred like it was moving when the picture was taken. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach tightening. I didn't remember that photo. Didn't remember taking it, or that spot in the woods. That night, I lay in bed listening to the creak of the trees and the occasional distant splash from the creek. Around midnight, I started hearing something else. A soft knocking, 3 slow taps coming from the back wall of the cabin. I held my breath waiting, thinking maybe it was a branch or some animal. Then it came again. 3 knocks, steady, measured. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, sweeping the beam around the clearing. Nothing moved. The woods were still. But when I turned to look behind the cabin, I saw something strange. A narrow path in the underbrush that hadn't been there before. Perfectly clean, as if something had walked it that very night. A tunnel of trees leading down into a hollow I didn't remember. But something in me did. Something old, something buried. The path shouldn't have been there. I walked that land 100 times as a kid, and I'd never seen anything like it. Narrow, almost too narrow, flanked by trees that curved inward like ribs. But there was something about it that pulled at me a deep, unsettling familiarity I couldn't shake. I stepped off the porch and followed it, without thinking, flashlight flickering, as I moved deeper into the woods. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and the distant memory of a name I didn't know I'd forgotten. Ryan. That name hit me like a punch. My cousin. We used to come up here together every summer until one year he just didn't. I'd always been told his family moved, that he transferred schools, but the memory was slippery now, like something I'd been told to forget. I kept walking deeper into the hollow until I reached a clearing I didn't recognize, and yet somehow did. In the center was a small, circular depression in the earth. No grass, no leaves, just smooth soil like something had once sat there, heavy and unmoving. Surrounding it were dozens of little wooden carvings, figures like dolls, some missing limbs, all turned inward. As I stepped closer, I saw something half buried in the dirt. I knelt and pulled it out a Polaroid. Water damaged, but still visible. Me and Ryan again, only this time we weren't smiling. We looked terrified, frozen in mid-run, and behind us was that same figure from the earlier photo, closer, now clearer. It wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin looked bark-like, mottled and rough, and where its eyes should have been were only deep hollows. I stood up fast, heart pounding, and that's when I heard my name. Not shouted, whispered. From the trees, I turned and saw movement slow, deliberate, just at the edge of the light. Something tall, watching. I ran, not caring where my feet landed, crashing through the woods, until I burst back into the clearing by the cabin. I didn't sleep. I didn't go back inside. I waited for dawn, the Polaroid still clenched in my hand, dirt under my nails, and the horrible realization pressing on my chest, Ryan never moved away. He was taken. And I had followed the same path he once did. The next morning, I packed up everything without eating or even stepping back inside the cabin. I left the photo on the porch face down, unable to look at it again. On the drive out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the tree line, still watching. I never told my mom what I found. I told her the cabin was fine, that she could go ahead and sell it. I haven't been back since, but sometimes when I'm alone and the world goes quiet, truly quiet, I feel that same cold press against my skin, like the trees are leaning in again. I've looked into old news reports, searched missing persons databases. There's no record of Ryan past the age of 9. It's like he vanished without a trace. Or maybe that's just how the hollow works. It doesn't just take people. It erases them, leaves behind fragments in the form of dreams and photographs that shouldn't exist. I know better now. Some places don't want to be remembered, and some memories don't come back by accident. I didn't just stumble onto that path. I was led. And if I'd taken even one more step into that clearing, I don't think I'd be here writing this. I think I'd be a name carved into the trees, just like him. Story 5, The Quiet Bunker. After my wife passed, I spent nearly a year avoiding people. Friends stopped calling. My co-workers gave up trying to pull me back into normalcy. I didn't blame them. Grief had turned everything gray, and I couldn't stomach the sound of small talk or the clatter of everyday life. So when a friend from college offered me the keys to his off-grid cabin in eastern Oregon, isolated, surrounded by national forest, I didn't hesitate. No internet, no neighbors, just trees and silence. Exactly what I thought I needed. I packed light and drove 10 hours straight, only stopping for gas and coffee. The road turned to gravel for the last stretch, winding through pines that grew denser with every mile. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was a small place, weathered and quiet, with a rusted propane tank out back and a wood pile stacked neatly along one wall. Inside it smelled of old cedar and dust, and I didn't unpack right away, just dropped my bag, lit a fire, and sat on the porch listening to the wind move through the branches. For the first time in months, the noise in my head seemed to ease. But just as the last light drained from the sky, I noticed something strange. A square patch of earth near the tree line, perfectly flat, and covered in pine needles with a single metal handle in the center. Like a door. One I didn't remember my friend mentioning. At first, I told myself it was probably just an old storm shelter or septic access, something practical and boring. But the more I looked at it, the more it bothered me. The pine needles covering it were too neatly arranged, as if someone had taken the time to make it look undisturbed. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked out with a flashlight and knelt beside the handle. The metal was cold, heavier than I expected, and creaked loudly when I pulled. Beneath it, a set of rusted metal steps, descended into darkness. The air that came out was dry and stale with a faint metallic scent like old batteries and stone. I should have closed it. I should have walked away. But the quiet had a weight to it, and part of me, some old restless part, needed to see what was down there. I grabbed my heavier flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The stairs led to a short concrete hallway, and then to a large, open room. The walls were bare. No markings, no furniture. Just a rusted cot in the corner, and a single bulb dangling from a cord in the ceiling. And in that silence, I realized something. The bulb was on. Dim, flickering, but undeniably lit. The cabin had no generator, and I hadn't touched any power source. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight cutting across the room, landing on something etched into the far wall. Rows and rows of hash marks scratched deep into the concrete. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. As I backed away, my light caught something else, an old tape recorder sitting on the floor, red light blinking. I stared at it, heart thudding, wondering how it still had power. Then, without me touching it, it clicked on. And a voice not mine, not my friend's, whispered my full name. My whole body locked up at the sound. It wasn't just that the voice knew my name, it was how it said it. Slow, intimate, like it had been waiting for me. I stood in that bunker flashlight, trembling in my hand, listening as the tape continued to play. The voice spoke in a low, hushed tone, almost a whisper, repeating details about me. No stranger could have known where I was born and the name of my childhood dog, the last words my wife said to me in the hospital. The recorder hissed, then clicked off. Silence again. I backed away, heart hammering, and turned toward the stairs. But that's when I heard it. Movement. Just a soft shuffle in the shadows behind the cot. I swung my light back toward it. Nothing there. The cot was empty. The floor was bare. But I could hear it breathing. Shallow, ragged like lungs, too old or too wrong to be human. I took one step backward, and that's when the bulb above me sparked and popped, casting the room into darkness. I ran. I didn't care about the noise. I just bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping as I slammed into the concrete wall. I scrambled up, barely getting the hatch shut behind me. I collapsed on the grass, gasping, tasting metal in my mouth. I stumbled back to the cabin and locked the door, every instinct screaming that I wasn't alone out there, that something had followed me up. I didn't sleep, just sat with my back against the door, clutching a fire poker like it would help. At sunrise, I opened the door slowly. Nothing was there, but the square patch of ground was once again covered in pine needles, perfectly arranged as if it had never been disturbed. I went to call my friend, demand an explanation, but when I pulled up his contact, it was gone. No number, no email, no trace. Like he'd never existed in my phone at all. I checked my email for the message he'd sent with the cabin directions. Nothing. I even checked my call history. Blank. That voice on the tape had said something else before it cut off. Just one sentence. We've missed you. I left the cabin that same morning, didn't bother cleaning up or locking the door. I just drove gravel kicking up behind me, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I reached cell service 2 hours later that I let myself breathe. I tried searching for the property for any mention of an old Cold War bunker in that part of Oregon. Nothing. No listings, no historical records, no online maps showing any structure near where I'd been. I even tried calling the number I thought belonged to my friend, but all I got was a disconnected tone. Back home, I dug through old photo albums, trying to find some proof of him, college yearbooks, class photos, anything. but there was nothing. No face I could match. No name I could place with certainty. I don't know what I stumbled into. I don't know who or what made that tape, or how it knew me so intimately. But ever since that day, the silence hasn't left me. It creeps into the edges of my life, settling in rooms where sound should be. I've started hearing faint clicks behind walls, soft static in my headphones, even when nothing's playing. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear that voice again, repeating the same words. We've missed you. Story 6. Last night in Glacier Point. Glacier Point had always been my favorite assignment. Perched high above Yosemite Valley, it offered a panoramic view of Half Dome and the endless sweep of the Sierra Nevada. For over 20 years, I worked as a seasonal park ranger, but this was my final season before retirement. I had turned 62 in the spring, and the department was quietly phasing me out. The younger guys were already calling me Old Man Cliff. I didn't mind. I just wanted one last quiet season at the Overlook before walking away for good. The week before Labor Day, I volunteered for an overnight shift at the small ranger station near Glacier Point. It was a simple wooden structure with a radio, a cot, and enough canned food to get through a couple of nights. Nothing fancy, just me and the mountains. I arrived late in the afternoon, logged my check-in, and sat outside watching the sun melt behind the cliffs. The air was crisp, the trees whispering in the wind, and the last of the tourists had trickled away. It felt peaceful, perfect even. But as darkness settled in, I noticed something strange. The radio, which had been silent all evening, crackled to life on its own. No voice, just static. Then very faintly, a single word came through. My name. Not my call sign. My actual name. Spoken like a whisper carried on cold wind. I sat frozen for a moment, staring at the radio. The air inside the cabin had gone still, like even the breeze outside had stopped to listen. I reached for the receiver, pressed the button, and replied with my call sign, trying to keep my voice steady. Nothing. Just static. I cycled through the other channels, thinking maybe one of the other rangers was messing with me, but no one responded. Eventually, the radio fell silent again. I chalked it up to a glitch, or maybe interference bouncing off the granite walls. Still, the way my name had come through, soft, deliberate, left a knot in my stomach. I tried to shake it off. Made myself a mug of instant coffee, sat by the window, and watched the stars blink into view. The overlook at night had always been beautiful, but that night it felt too quiet. Around midnight, I heard a crunch outside. Footsteps on gravel. I stood up slowly and reached for my flashlight, opened the door and scanned the clearing. Nothing. No movement. But the footsteps started again, circling the station. Not hurried, just slow and steady, like someone pacing. I stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Still nothing. But I noticed something odd in the dirt, a set of boot prints. They circled the station twice, then stopped 10 feet from the door. The last pair faced the cabin. Whoever had made them had just stood there watching. I called out, thinking maybe a hiker had gotten lost. No answer. Only silence. Then the radio clicked back on from inside, and once again, my name came through. This time clearer. This time closer. I stepped back into the ranger station, heart pounding, and walked straight to the radio. The static had stopped, and for a few seconds, there was only silence, like the line was open, but no one was speaking. Then I heard it again. My name spoken slowly, almost lovingly, followed by a low whisper I couldn't quite make out. I leaned in, trying to make sense of it, when suddenly the lights flickered and went out. The cabin dropped into total darkness, except for the faint glow of the moon leaking through the window. I reached for my flashlight, flipped it on, and spun around to face the door. It was open. I was sure I'd closed it when I came back in. But now it stood wide, swinging slightly on its hinges. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something standing just beyond the doorway. Not a figure exactly, more like the shape of a man, blurred at the edges like heat rising off pavement. It didn't move, didn't flinch when the light hit it. It just stood there watching me. Then it spoke. Same voice, same name. Only this time it said more. "You're not done yet." I raised the flashlight higher, trying to focus the beam, but it blinked out without warning. Total darkness again. I fumbled backward, tripping over the chair and hitting the floor hard. When I looked up, the figure was inside, standing over me. I couldn't see its face, only the outline of shoulders, arms, and something that shimmered where eyes should have been. I reached for the flare gun mounted near the door and fired without thinking. The flash lit up the whole room in a burst of red, and for a split second I saw its face. It was mine. Older, hollow. The skin was cracked like dry bark, and the mouth was stretched into a half smile that didn't look human. Then it was gone. No sound, no trace. No, just the fading glow of the flare and the smell of burned sulfur. I lay there for a long time, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing came. Just silence again, thick and unmoving. Like the mountain itself was holding its breath. When morning finally came, I stepped out of the cabin and found the world unchanged. Birds were chirping, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and Half Dome stood silent and unmoved in the distance. But I knew better. Something had been there with me that night, something wearing my face. I packed my things with shaking hands, made my final log entry, and didn't mention the encounter. What would I even say? That the mountain whispered my name and showed me a version of myself that shouldn't exist. I hiked down without telling a soul. I retired a week later, turned in my badge, and moved to a small coastal town where the fog rolls in, thick and familiar, but the silence still follows me. Sometimes the wind carries voices through the trees behind my house, and I find footprints in the sand that match mine exactly, even though I haven't been walking. I've stopped looking in mirrors at night. I'm afraid of what I'll see. Glacier Point gave me a gift in that final shift, if you can call it that. A glimpse into something beyond understanding. Something waiting. And I can't help but wonder if that voice was right. Maybe I'm not done yet. Maybe none of us are. Story 7. She was waiting in the tree line. I just moved to a small town in northern Vermont after quitting my job in the city. The stress, the noise, the constant deadlines, I couldn't take it anymore. So I cashed out my savings, rented a cheap cabin near the edge of a forest preserve, and told myself I'd stay until I figured things out. The town was quiet, and the kind where everyone nods politely, but no one asks questions. That suited me just fine. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, with creaky floorboards and a wood stove that filled the place with a comforting scent of pine. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, staring out into the trees. There was something peaceful about the way the forest wrapped around the property, like the world had finally stopped spinning. The first 2 weeks passed in a kind of blissful fog. I read books, chopped wood, learned how to cook over fire. But on the 15th night, something changed. I was sitting outside just after sunset, watching the light drain from the sky, when I noticed movement near the tree line. A figure, still almost perfectly still, standing between two trunks. I blinked, leaned forward. Whoever it was didn't move, just stood there, watching. I called out, but the figure didn't answer. Didn't flinch, just stood, waiting At first I thought it might be a neighbor, maybe someone hiking through the woods who got turned around. But the figure didn't move, not even when I shined my flashlight toward the trees. The beam didn't quite reach her, because I was sure now it was a woman. But it was enough to catch the pale blur of a face just between the trunks. Still motionless, still watching. I stood up, called out again, louder this time. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No answer, no reaction, just silence. I took a step toward the tree line, and that's when she moved barely, just a small tilt of her head, like she was acknowledging me. I stopped. My skin prickled with the sensation that I shouldn't go further, that crossing into those trees would be a mistake. After a few more minutes of silence, I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off her. As I reached the cabin, I blinked and she was gone. Not walked away, just gone. I spent the rest of the night inside, all the lights on, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe a deer? Maybe my imagination. But later that afternoon, I found something strange on the edge of the woods. A small bundle wrapped in faded cloth, sitting at the exact spot where she had stood. I unwrapped it slowly, my hands shaking. Inside was a lock of long black hair tied with twine and a note yellowed and damp. It read in messy handwriting, "You saw her. Now she sees you." I dropped the bundle like it burned me and backed away, heart racing. Who had written that note? How did they know what I saw? I looked toward the tree line again, half expecting her to be there, but the woods were quiet. Still. I told myself it was a prank, maybe some local kids messing with the newcomer. I even tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt thin and hollow in my throat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the porch light on and moved a chair near the window, watching the tree line like a sentry. Midnight came and went. The forest was silent. Then around 2:30, the porch light flickered, and that's when I saw her again. She was closer now, no longer standing at the edge of the trees. She was halfway across the clearing, facing the cabin, head tilted the same eerie way. Her long black hair hung wet and matted around her shoulders, and even from that distance, I could tell something was wrong with her eyes. They were too dark, too empty. I watched frozen as she lifted her hand, not in a wave, but a slow beckoning motion, like she wanted me to come outside. I didn't move. I couldn't. She stood like that for maybe a minute, then slowly lowered her arm and turned back toward the forest. But before she disappeared, she looked back over her shoulder. Not at the house, directly at me. Through the window, through the dark. The next morning, I found footprints in the damp grass, bare feet, small, leading from the tree line straight to the porch. And carved into the wood just beside the door, as if with a fingernail, was a single word: soon. That evening, the power went out just after sunset. I lit a candle, heart pounding, and turned to check the lock on the door. And there, pressed against the glass from the outside, was her face. No expression, no movement, just watching. I blinked, and she vanished again. But I knew then, she wasn't just waiting. She was getting closer. I left the cabin the next morning without looking back. I didn't pack, didn't lock the door, just grabbed my keys and drove until the forest gave way to open fields and paved roads. I checked into a motel 3 towns over and sat under the fluorescent light, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself I hadn't lost my mind. But I couldn't forget her face. That blank, watching expression. I reported what happened to the local sheriff, but he just gave me a tired look and muttered something about folks seeing things when they're alone too long. He didn't take my name, didn't write anything down. back home in the city, I tried to rebuild my life, but the feeling never left me. I started seeing glimpses of her in crowds, reflections, dreams, always at the edge, always watching. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my fingernails or pine needles on my floor, even though I live in a fifth-floor apartment. Once I found a second toothbrush in my bathroom. I live alone. I've read about certain spirits ones that don't haunt places but people. You don't find them, they find you. She didn't just belong to the forest. She was waiting for someone to notice her. And I did. Now she waits for me. Everywhere. Story 8. The Cabin That Moved. I found the listing by accident, an old hunting cabin in Montana's Bitterroot Range, miles from the nearest road. The photos were grainy, but something about it called to me. I'd been looking to get away after a bad divorce and the death of my father, and this place with its crooked chimney and overgrown path looked like the kind of quiet I needed. The price was suspiciously low, but I didn't care. I wired the money, packed my truck, and headed north. The last 10 miles were rough. No cell signal, no signs, just winding dirt roads, and the occasional rusted mailbox with no name. When I finally found the trailhead, I had to hike the last mile in with my pack. The air was thinner up there, the forest thick and unmoving. And when I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly as the photo had shown. Slanted roof, mossy walls, an ancient horseshoe nailed above the crooked door. Inside was dusty but dry. There was a cot, a cast iron stove, and an old journal left behind by someone named Ellis. No last name. Just a few scattered entries, weather notes, animal sightings, and one strange line at the bottom of the first page: if you wake up and the trees have changed, don't go outside. It means the cabin has moved again. I laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But part of me even then felt like the walls were leaning in to listen. The first few nights were calm. I chopped firewood during the day, cooked simple meals on the old stove, and read Ellis's journal by lantern light. There was a strange peace in the solitude, a silence so deep it almost hummed. I started to understand why someone would choose to disappear here. But on the fourth morning, I stepped outside and felt a strange shift in the air. The clearing looked different. The slope of the hill that had always been on the west side now arose on the east. A stream I hadn't seen before trickled just beyond the tree line. I stood there for a full minute, trying to convince myself I had just remembered things wrong. Back inside, I flipped through Ellis's journal again, landing on a page I must have overlooked. Scrawled in the margin were the words, "The forest lies when it moves. It makes you doubt your own mind." I slammed the journal shut, a nervous laugh bubbling out of me. Maybe it was just cabin fever, a little disorientation. But that night, the wind outside howled louder than before. The walls creaked like something was pushing against them, testing them. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunches in the dead leaves just outside the cabin. I killed the lantern and crouched by the window, heart hammering. Through the warped glass, I saw nothing but shadows. Then movement. A figure tall and thin, drifting between the trees. I couldn't make out a face. It didn't seem to walk so much as glide, never touching the ground. And just before it vanished into the woods, it turned its head toward me. No eyes, just dark hollow pits. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to move. And when the sun rose, the cabin door was open. The latch still bolted. I should have left that morning. I told myself I would pack my bag, hike back to the trailhead, never look back. But something held me there, like the air itself had thickened around the cabin, slowing every movement. When I stepped outside, the world was wrong again. The trees were too close packed together, like they were leaning in, and the sky overhead seemed lower, dimmer somehow, like twilight had stretched its fingers over the sun. I turned in a full circle and realized the trail was gone, completely swallowed by brush that hadn't been there yesterday. That's when I knew. The cabin had moved. Back inside, I tore through Ellis's journal. Near the back, in frantic handwriting, he'd written, "It moves to feed, to be seen, and it brings something with it." Page after page was filled with the same word, repeated over and over, "Stay, stay, 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 stay." I dropped the book when I heard the knock. Not on the door, on the back wall. 3 slow knocks. I crept to the rear of the cabin, every nerve in my body screaming to run. There was no one there, no window, just solid timber. Then another knock, this time beneath my feet. I backed toward the stove, grabbing the fire poker like it would help. The knocking stopped. The silence pressed in, heavier than before. And then the back wall shifted. Wood groaned. A seam appeared where there hadn't been one, and something began to emerge. It looked human at first, arms, shoulders, but it was wrong. Too thin. The joints bent the wrong way, and its head lolled like it couldn't hold its own weight. It dragged itself through the wall, not breaking it, but sliding through like smoke. Its face was blank, smooth skin where eyes and mouth should be. And yet somehow I could feel it looking at me. I screamed and swung the poker, hitting nothing but cold air. The thing shimmered, pulsed, and then vanished, the wall snapping shut, like a mouth clamping down. I stood there panting, soaked in sweat, waiting for something else to happen. But the cabin was still again, as if nothing had moved, as if nothing had come through. But when I turned around, the journal was gone. In its place was a new note written in that same frantic hand, "You're part of it now." I ran the next morning, no bag, no food, just my boots and the clothes on my back. I didn't care which direction I took, I just moved, crashing through underbrush, scraping my arms on pine and rock, until I finally stumbled onto a dirt road hours later. A local hunter found me there, dehydrated and babbling about a cabin that moves and a faceless thing that lives inside the walls. He gave me water and a ride into town, but said nothing while I talked, just nodded with this distant, haunted look in his eyes. Before he left, he said quietly, "You stayed the night, didn't you?" That's how it gets in. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Back in the city, I tried to put it all behind me, tried to explain it away as stress or grief or even a break from reality. But I still hear it sometimes. The knocking, always in threes, sometimes under my bed, sometimes in the walls, and I dream of waking up in that cabin again. Same air, same trees, same heavy silence pressing on my chest. I never see the thing anymore, but I know it's there just behind the walls, waiting, shifting, looking for a way back through me. Because I left the cabin, but I don't think the cabin ever left me. Story 9. The Men Who Knocked at 3:17. I had just started a new job as a seasonal night caretaker for an old trail lodge in Idaho's Sawtooth Mountains. It was remote, cut off by snow for most of the year, and I was the only one stationed there from October through March. The lodge was built in the 1940s, a long stretch of creaking pine and stone tucked beside a frozen lake. Most of my nights were uneventful checking boilers, logging temperatures, radioing in once a day to a ranger station 3 hours away. The solitude didn't bother me. After a messy breakup and too many sleepless nights in the city, the silence was welcome. But on the 13th night, something odd happened. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping on the main entrance. Not loud. Just 3 gentle knocks. I lay there for a moment, half asleep, before realizing no one should be up here. No guests, no hikers, no cars could make it through the snow this time of year. I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the long, dark hallway toward the front door. When I opened it, no one was there. Just the frozen lake glowing faintly under the moon. I told myself it was probably the wind or a tree branch. But then I noticed something in the snow footprints. 2 sets, leading up to the door, and none leading away. I stood in the doorway, shivering, staring at the 2 sets of footprints. They were clean and defined, as if freshly made, no melting, no snow drifting into them. Just 2 sets of boots that came right up to the door and stopped. No tracks leading away in any direction. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just black forest and the soft hiss of wind over the frozen lake. I shut the door, bolted it, and told myself I'd check again in the morning. When the sun rose, the prints were gone. Not faded gone. The snow was smooth and untouched, like nothing had ever been there. I tried not to dwell on it, but to dwell. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But that night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., I woke again to 3 soft knocks. This time they came from the back door, the one that led into the woods. I didn't move. I just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening as the wind outside went dead still. The lodge felt wrong, too quiet, like something was holding its breath. The knocking didn't repeat. Just 3 knocks, then silence. I waited for sunrise like a child, afraid of the dark. The next day I searched the entire perimeter. No prints, no signs of animals or people. Just that same untouched snow. That evening, I checked every door and window 3 times before bed. I even moved a heavy chair in front of the back door just in case. But when I woke up at 3:17, again without an alarm, without fail, the chair had been moved, not pushed aside, placed neatly to the left. And beside it, pressed into the wooden floor, were 2 wet boot prints, facing inward. I didn't sleep the next night. I sat in the lounge area by the front window with the fire burning low and a flashlight clutched in my hand. I watched the minute hand crawl toward 3:17. My breath shallow, chest tight. The wind howled outside, but inside, everything was still. When the clock on the mantel clicked to 3:17 a.m., the fire sputtered once and went out. Just like that. Gone. And then the knocking came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks this time from the window right behind me. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. But there was nothing. Just the faint outline of trees and the reflection of my pale, wide-eyed face. No footprints, no fog on the glass. I got up and backed away, heart hammering. Then I heard voices. Faint, murmuring, coming from inside the lodge. Not one voice, 2. Low and male whispering words I couldn't quite understand. Like a conversation taking place in the next room. I followed the sound through the halls. The lodge was empty. The voices stopped when I reached the kitchen, and that's when I saw the door. There had never been a door there before. It was narrow, old, made of warped cedar with a tarnished brass knob. I reached for it with trembling fingers, unsure if I was dreaming. When I opened it, a cold gust hit me like a slap. Behind it was not a closet or storage space, but a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. I called out, my voice small, but got no answer. Just that same whispering growing louder now, as if coming up the stairs. I slammed the doors shut and dragged a cabinet in front of it. The voices stopped immediately. That morning, the door was gone. Just smooth wall where it had been. But in my logbook, which I'd left closed on the desk, a new entry had been written. not in my handwriting. We knocked. You listened. We're almost through. I tried to leave that day. Packed my gear, radioed for pickup. But the signal was dead. And that night, I waited for 317 with the lights on and every door locked. But I already knew. Locks don't matter. Not when they're already inside. I was found 5 days later by the relief crew, curled up in the generator room, dehydrated, half-conscious, muttering about knocks and doors that weren't supposed to be there. They flew me out by helicopter. The ranger in charge said the logs were empty, no new entries since my first week. No sign of forced entry, no strange door. Just a lodge left cold and quiet. But something followed me back. I know it did. Back in the city, the number 317 started appearing in strange places, receipts, license plates, timestamps on my phone. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and hear faint knocking in the walls. Not loud, not urgent, just waiting. I've moved 3 times, tried sleeping with noise machines, changed my routines. Nothing helps. A few nights ago, I came home to find muddy boot prints leading from my front door to my bedroom. My locks were still latched, windows closed, nothing taken. But on my pillow was a folded piece of paper. It read, "The door is open now." I don't know what they are. I don't know what they want. But they found me. And they don't need the lodge anymore. Now they knock from inside. And sooner or later, I'll have to answer. Story 10. Behind the Window in Willow Creek. I first heard about the old Willow Creek Ranger Station from my grandfather. He used to say it was the last place you'd want to spend a night alone, though he never said why. After he passed, I found an envelope in his desk with a hand-drawn map and a single line. Don't look in the window after dark. That warning lingered in my mind when I took a photography trip through Northern California and decided to find the place for myself. The station was deeper in the forest than any map suggested. I followed narrow, overgrown trails for hours, pushing through thickets until the trees finally opened to reveal a clearing and a sagging log building with moss-covered shingles. The air around it was still heavier than the rest of the woods, as if time didn't pass the same way there. The place looked abandoned for decades, but strangely intact. The glass in the single front window was unbroken. The door creaked open with little effort. Inside was dust leaves and the scent of wet wood. A few rusted cots lined the walls. On one of them sat an old ranger's logbook, still dry despite the damp. I sat down planning to spend the night. Just one night. I should have remembered the warning. I should never have looked through the window. The sun dipped fast behind the trees, swallowing the clearing in early shadows. I lit a small camp lantern and flipped through the ranger's logbook, hoping to find stories or trail notes. The entries started normal weather reports, wildlife sightings, but somewhere in the middle, the handwriting changed. It became rushed, erratic. One line stood out, window watches back. Curtains lie. My hand paused on the page. I glanced toward the front window. There were no curtains. As night thickened, the forest grew silent. Too silent. Even the crickets seemed to have vanished. I tried to settle in, convincing myself I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But sometime after midnight, I heard soft rustling outside. Not wind, not animals. It was rhythmic, like someone circling the cabin, slowly brushing against the wooden walls. I froze, heart racing, every instinct screaming to stay down, to not look. But I did. I couldn't help myself. I moved toward the window and peered through the glass. At first I saw only trees. Then something shifted. Between the trunks stood a figure. tall, motionless, barely outlined by moonlight. It had no flashlight, no pack, just watching. I blinked and it was closer, not walking, just suddenly standing 10 feet nearer, still and silent. I dropped behind the window ledge, breath held tight. The logbook sat open on the floor beside me. I glanced down and saw a new entry had been scribbled under my own name, though I hadn't written it. It read, "He looked." I snapped the book shut and backed away, the wind outside suddenly rising in a low moan. The cabin groaned as if shifting in its foundation. I wanted to believe it was all a dream or a trick of the dark. But I knew I had done exactly what my grandfather warned against. I had looked through the window, and now something had seen me too. I spent the rest of the night curled in a corner with my back to the wall, staring at the door, flinching at every creak. Whatever I'd seen in the trees never knocked, never approached the cabin again. But I could feel it still watching. The air had changed. It was heavier now, colder. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. The shadows never shifted. And when morning came, the light was gray and dull, like the sun had forgotten how to rise. I opened the door to leave, but the clearing outside was wrong. The trees were too close. The trail was gone. The path I had hacked open just the day before now ended in thorns and dense growth. It was as if the forest had healed overnight, closing in around the cabin. I shouted, but my voice felt swallowed, dampened. I tried pushing through the brush, desperate to find any familiar landmark. But no matter how far I walked, I always circled back to the cabin. On the third attempt, I returned to find the front window open, just a crack. I hadn't touched it. When I stepped inside, the lantern was lit again, and on the ranger's cot, the logbook lay open to a new page. More writing, different handwriting. It said, "Once you look, it remembers you. The window doesn't keep it out. It lets it in." Then I noticed something else. The photos on my camera, random shots I had taken while hiking in, had changed. Each one now had the same figure in the distance, always at the edge of the frame, always a little closer than before. That night, I barricaded the window and refused to sleep. Around 2:00 a.m., the whispers began. They came from the walls, the floorboards, even inside my head. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew they were meant for me. I covered my ears, but the voices grew louder until one phrase finally broke through clearly, "Let us see through you." The window creaked open again, just slightly. Not from wind, not from age. Something was testing it, testing me. That was when I understood. The cabin wasn't haunted. It was hungry. And the window was how it hunted, through those who dared to look. I made it out 2 days later, at least I think I did. I don't remember how I found the trail again. One moment I was screaming at the trees, begging for a way out, and the next I stumbled into a ranger crew repairing a washed-out bridge miles from the station. They said I looked pale, dehydrated, like I'd been lost for a week. But I'd only spent 3 nights there, maybe 4. I still don't know. I never told them about the figure or the window. I just nodded when they said I was lucky. They offered to retrieve my gear from the cabin, but I told them to burn it. Every piece, especially the camera, especially the logbook. Back home, things were quiet for a while, but some nights I wake up just before dawn and feel something near the window. I can't see it, but I feel watched. I've moved since, covered every window in my house. Still, I hear soft creaking when the wind is still. And sometimes I find fingerprints on the inside of the glass. My grandfather never went back to Willow Creek after his visit. I think he looked too. I think the cabin marked him the same way it marked me. I just hope I can end it by never looking again. But the thing is, sometimes it doesn't wait for you to look. Sometimes it looks first. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.